Dr. Ramani describes narcissism as the secondhand smoke of mental health. But why? And why is narcissism more dangerous than just being self-confident? What exactly narcissistic personality disorder is? Yeah. What is it?
Okay, all people with narcissistic personality disorder are obviously narcissistic, okay? Not all people who are narcissistic may have narcissistic personality disorder. So it's a fine point, but it's an important point since everybody's throwing this word around these days, right? You know, it's not, unlike other diagnoses that have different meaning to them, this one's this is like a character assassination, right? So when we talk about narcissistic personality disorder, there's a long list of patterns, and they have to have 5 of the 9 on that list.
Yes.
It has to be something we call pervasive, meaning it cuts across situations with a variety of people, at work, at home. It's not just like they're narcissistic to only you and they're nice to everyone in the world. It tends to be pervasive. But here's the rub. It has to involve what we call social and occupational impairment and subjective distress. That's a fancy way of saying it is messing up that person's life. They're aware it's messing up their life and they're uncomfortable with it. And that's where you don't see as many people with narcissistic personality disorder. So if their style of not having empathy, of being entitled, of being grandiose, of being arrogant and superficial, and all that is working out for them, they're not going to walk around saying, I'm having a problem. They're not going to walk around saying, this is causing me problems. So if they don't acknowledge that piece of it, then really they're a narcissist, which is sort of a clinical term for being a jerk. And we don't get to diagnose people for being a jerk. We may not like them, but that's not a condition we diagnose. We diagnose people because they're bringing in something that they're uncomfortable with or that's causing them problems. The best example I can give you is, let's say somebody's been using drugs for 2 years and their drug use results in DUIs and other problems in their lives, okay? When that happens, they may themselves say, I don't have a problem with drugs, but I do have 5 DUIs and they did find me in the gutter and from my mom's house. So I guess, well, maybe there's a problem. In narcissism, they may recognize that, yeah, sure, I got in trouble at work and I was called out on this and that problem and I did cheat on my wife several times, but it's working out for me. Is that distress? He's being a jerk. So Dr. Dr. Francis is actually one of the architects of this diagnosis originally in the DSM. And he himself has come out very clearly and said, we don't get to diagnose somebody because we don't like them. That's not what this diagnosis is for. It's for somebody who's actually having discomfort and distress because they're behaving in this narcissistic manner. It's a fine point, but it's an important point. And here at MedCircle, I really want to be careful as we use these 2 terms because I think a lot of the listeners don't know if their friend, family member, or boss has the diagnosis and may never find out unless that other person, gets into treatment.
And their friend, family member, boss might just be a jerk.
They might be a jerk, and they may say, why should I go get a diagnosis? There's nothing wrong with me. And if they're walking around saying there's nothing wrong with me and I'm fine,
then according to the DSM, they're not.
They're not.
They're not they don't have NPD.
No, that's it. And that's where people get upset. I get emails every day. Will you talk to my husband and tell him he has narcissistic personality disorder? I'm like, no. Absolutely not.
Please, I would love to do that.
No win there. So that's a lot of the struggle here is that, and you know what? The pattern of narcissism, it's awful. They may be fine with it, but you as the recipient of that pattern, you're going to struggle with it. It's uncomfortable. It's one of those patterns that's really unhealthy for the people around it. I call it the secondhand smoke of psychiatry. Like being near a person who's narcissistic, it's as unhealthy as doing it yourself.
Whoa. That is a great metaphor. NPD is the secondhand smoke of psychiatry.
And I'd say narcissism is the secondhand smoke of our time.
Of our time.
You stand close enough to it, you're going to get sick.
That's a huge deal for people because somebody might not get the diagnosis.
Yeah, they just
but they still have all these toxic behaviors that are affecting you.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? In some ways, the diagnosis is irrelevant because all that's doing is saying the person's having problems because of it. But if they're lying, manipulating, exploiting, raging at you, who cares if they have a diagnosis? That's not good for you to be in the presence of. And then it takes us back to that more critical issues. Why are people like this? They're like this because they're insecure. And that makes people feel guilty. Well, if he's insecure and this is why he's doing this, and that's what we're going to have to get to the core of.
When does normal self-confidence cross the line into grandiosity?
Self-confidence is a healthy state. And people who are self-confident don't need to blast their achievements from every rooftop and every social media platform. People who are truly self-confident don't need to talk over other people and their achievement. People who are self-confident don't require their achievements to be front and center and ahead of everybody else's. People who are self-confident are so confident in their sense of self and their achievements that they actually can stay quiet about it.
In another video in this series, we'll talk about the different types of NPD, but I'll give everyone a preview from the original video we did, the communal narcissist.
The communal narcissist.
When you said it's that person who goes and volunteers on a Saturday but takes selfies the whole time in a full perfect face of makeup, I go, oh, I so know that person.
You know, and it's also the person who you say like, let's throw a gala. And you're like, but the gala's gonna cost $10,000 and you're only gonna make $500 for the charity. Why not just write the full $10,000 for the charity? Like, but I need the gala. They need galas. They need galas. They need parties. They need celebrations.
And you know what? I'm smiling when you say that because I think smiling is one of my coping mechanisms, by the way, like laughter and smiling, because these are very deep and heavy topics.
Yeah,
and they're affecting a lot of everybody who's in a relationship with a narcissist.
Which is almost everybody.
Which is almost everybody. And in a lot of cases, there are narcissists or people with NPD who are suffering.
If you want to get down to the core of it, they are suffering because they're deeply insecure. And that's where, but do they experience it as suffering? I'll tell you this, like I said, with the people with NPD or narcissism, where we start peeling back the layers, by the time you get down to layer 10 and you start looking in the gaping hole, it's not comfortable for them. And your heart does ache for them because there's almost a childlike emptiness to them. I'm not saying I'd want to be in a relationship with them, though. I can tell you that right now. I mean, I can handle it for an hour at a time, but my God, for a person who actually has to live with that day in and day out, it's a nightmare.
Are there common co-occurring disorders with people with NPD?
People who have narcissistic personality disorder or even narcissistic traits, there are several co-occurring patterns we can see that are more likely to happen. All forms of substance use disorders. A lot of times it's to fill the emptiness or to enhance the grandiosity. So alcohol use, cocaine use, a stimulant use, that kind of thing. So you'll see some of that. Depression. Interestingly, narcissism and depression can hang out together. A lot of it is that insecurity and that emptiness. It's not unusual to see those two kind of hanging out together.
But are they getting diagnosed with depression?
Sometimes they're getting diagnosed with depression because they might be very irritable. We'll see that in men. What will happen is you'll sometimes confuse the two as well, because a type of narcissism we're going to be talking about today is called covert narcissism. People who are covert narcissists, they're a little bit like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. It's like, woe is me, no one understands me, how come the world is so unfair to me? And they seem so downtrodden that they look depressed. And then all of us will treat them as though they're depressed, and we're making absolutely no headway. And then one day you dawns on you, you're like, oh, this isn't depression at all. So actually, quite frankly, we'll often treat the depressed, we'll think they're depressed before we'll think they're narcissistic.
Wrongly so.
But wrongly so.
Yeah, again, just highlighting how important it is to get the right diagnosis.
It really is, because these personality patterns also make treating other mental health conditions. For example, it's not unusual for narcissism to also be found coexisting with bipolar disorder, which is also a very messy kind of issue to treat, because the grandiosity of the mania and the grandiosity of the narcissism often collide. So you'll see that too. And when I've worked with families of when they have adult children who are substance abusers and the adult child goes into rehab, I'll also know that adult child has narcissism, and I'll ache for them, because they're thinking their child's going to go to rehab, not only come out sober, but sweet. They come out sober, but they're still as irritable, invalidating, sort of mean as they always were. That part's not going to go away. That's the narcissism.
Maybe even more so?
Even more so. And you see this a lot in substance abuse treatment circles, that you see a lot of it together. Yes, exactly, because the substance use was sort of helping them kind of shore up their defenses. And so it can make treatment much, much more complicated. You'll also see a greater likelihood of, for example, like patterns that are sometimes labeled love and sex addiction, kinds of like compulsive sexuality, compulsive like relationship patterns. You'll see that coexisting with narcissism as well. It just makes everything that much harder to treat.
Yes.
That's what it is, because you don't tend to get as much emotion. There's a lot more defensiveness. I know more than the doctor. There is a lack of empathy. There's a lot of projection. All this stuff really makes it hard to do really deep psychotherapy with somebody.
How many different types of NPD are there?
Well, there's different kinds of narcissism.
Okay.
Whether those translate into subtypes of narcissistic personality disorder. I once said there's 9 possible symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder, which means there's thousands and thousands of possible combinations.
Right.
But if we were really to look at it in 5 patterns that I've sort of broken down in my book, and this is based on the theoretical work on narcissism, drawing from other people's work, when we talk about the types of narcissism, they're not really subtypes of narcissistic personality disorder, but there are different kinds of patterns we see of narcissism. And I think it's important to see the differences because it shows us this doesn't look the same across everyone. And then some people say, well, that's not narcissism. The person I know acts like this. And I'll say, but it's a similar pattern. Let's get down to the brass tacks of what all narcissists look like. In all narcissism, we tend to see a lack of empathy, grandiosity, entitlement, superficiality, chronic seeking of validation outside of them, arrogance, and a real tendency towards rage, as well as a tendency to manipulate or exploit other people. Those you tend to see across the board to varying degrees. So let's start at the top with what I consider the most severe and problematic narcissistic pattern, and that's the malignant or the toxic narcissist. These are the folks that almost look like psychopaths. They'll exploit other people, they take advantage of other people, they lie, they cheat, they work the system to their advantage. They can often be quite successful. You might wonder, why am I not calling them psychopaths? They can sometimes feel remorse for what they're doing. They're like, this isn't cool, but I just got to get this part done and then I'll make it right. Mm-hmm. Whereas a psychopath wouldn't need to make it right. So there's just a really manipulative, mean-spirited edge to them that can be very unsettling. But when you first meet them, they're extraordinarily charming, extraordinarily charismatic, confident, successful. So that's sort of your malignant, toxic type. You'll often see these folks running big companies, at the heads of government, all of that. Like they really know how to work a system.
Wow.
The next in the group is what I call sort of your classical grandiose narcissist. And that's what most of us think of. Mm-hmm. The person who's braggy, who really is entitled, I'm special, I deserve special treatment. It's almost like your celebrity narcissist. That's what your grandiose narcissist. They brag a lot, they show off a lot. Look at my new car, look at my new this, look at my new girlfriend. It's a lot of show and tell. They suck all the oxygen out of the room. All the usual traits, but they don't tend to be as exploitative and as mean as a malignant narcissist, but they are sort of your classical kind of narcissist. The next narcissist on the list, and this is probably the most mysterious one and maybe the most revealing to MedCircle listeners, is the covert or vulnerable narcissist. These are the woe is me narcissists. If the world could see how great I am, I'd be one of the great ones, but nobody gets me because I'm ahead of my time. And so you'll often find them sort of at home huddled over their computer being like a troll or like coming up with their next big plan, but they almost have a failure to launch a lot of the time. They can often look depressed. They seem vulnerable because they almost feel like the world doesn't get them. They're hypersensitive to criticism. But they lack empathy and they can be very entitled. Like, I deserve special treatment because, the world doesn't know this, but I'm the best.
What's interesting about that is I listened to that and when you would first meet somebody like that, you think, oh, they just have low self-esteem.
Yeah, bingo.
But all narcissists have low self-esteem,
bingo,
right?
exactly.
That's why they're doing that.
Exactly. So the covert narcissists, they lead with that, but it's almost like they feel like they have this sort of strange, I always say that the covert narcissist has this sort of weird pause. They'll say, yeah, I went to that college, but I guess nobody cares. And they'll do that weird thing, like, okay, well, that's a little bit of a strange pause, but they're like, yeah, I already read that book, but why would you care? It's like one of those. It's like,
wow.
There's a little bit, there's an edge. It's almost like you're sticking your hand into a bucket of barbed wire. It doesn't feel good. It's like,
but even with those examples, even though they were just, random examples, I still feel the pain for that person.
Oh, they feel the world pass them by.
Yeah, but I don't feel the same way with a grandiose narcissist.
You won't as
or
much, no.
yeah.
They feel, the covert narcissist, though, ultimately will get to the point where they feel the world owes them something. The world owes me. And there'll be a real edge to them, because they seem really sad, and you'll often try to help them, and you'll wonder why they're so ungrateful. Well, that's why that can feel really uncomfortable for other people who are so sympathetic to them and wonder, why are they not ever saying thank you or recognizing all we did?
Yeah.
Now, number 4 is the communal narcissist. The communal narcissist can be very confusing because they're out there volunteering and flying all over the world and doing their own personal rescue missions. And, after every hurricane, they're posting online hurricane goals, #hurricane goals. And like, let's all raise enough money and let's send lots of stuff to animals.
They're the hashtag narcissist.
They're the hashtag narcissist. Yeah. But they're like, it's all about their goals for helping the world. And like, you'll see them, you know about animal rescue people, like they're always holding their rescue dogs, but then they go home and they're really mean to their husband. And they love going to galas and they want buildings named after them. And if they do give a donation, they have to hold 20 gold shovels and have lots of pictures taken. Like, it's all about they do all these things to get validation. That's their tool for getting validation. They're often really unkind to the people, their immediate family, or the people who work under them. They can be absolutely awful to them. And people say, oh my gosh, you're so lucky you work with him. He's so charitable. And the people are just like, oh no, this is really
That's one of
nice.
many characteristics he is.
So the communal narcissist is it takes a while to sort of to peel off that layer, and then to sort of, that's why I always say, pay attention to how a person treats the person who don't have as much power as them in that situation, because that's going to teach you a lot. So they'll be really sweet to the recipient of the charitable dollars, but really mean to the person who's working with them, and that doesn't add up. The last narcissist is sort of kind of a good nature. I'm going to call them the benign narcissist. The benign narcissist is like this sort of clueless, uninsightful person who just says really vapid things, very superficial, only cares like, all I want is like a fast car, and you're driving a piece of junk. Like, they'll be very dismissive of other people.
This sounds like every 16-year-old I've ever met.
In many ways, there's an adolescence, there's an immaturity, but they really aren't that mean-spirited, and you can actually kind of say, that's not a nice thing to say, and they're like, well, yeah, I guess so, but then they'll go back and say it the next day. I always say it's nice to have a few benign narcissists on deck because they're fun to have at a party. Like, just keep them on that list, but never turn to them at a time of need.
Just because I'm curious, and I get to ask questions, which, somebody put me in charge to do this. Who would you most want to be in a relationship with? If
those are
were
my
the
5.
Those are your 5.
Oh, mama, and just solitude and in a cabin isn't enough. Because I'm going to take, if solitude in a cabin is my option, I'm going with that one.
Okay, so it's not an option.
I don't think any of those are a good
you have to
choice.
choose one.
You have to choose one?
You have to choose one.
I might choose the communal narcissist and just be glad they're doing nice things for other
That
people.
was my
Hope to
choice.
God they're nice to me.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, that can be exhausting because when the whole world is saying, you're so lucky, he's so charitable.
Right.
You're like, oh my gosh, he hasn't said something nice to me in 15 years. They're all painful. Maybe the benign one, but even that, you feel like you're forever in a relationship with your high school boyfriend.
Right.
That's not nice.
Right.
So if the cabin by myself for the rest of my life isn't a possibility, I'm going communal.
I get it.
With therapy.
I can have a cabin from you like 2 acres away.
Yeah,
and then we
no.
can just meet when we want to hang out.
I don't recommend any of these types for a relationship.
But what about my idea for, I'll have a cabin 1 acre away from yours?
That I'll do that.
Okay, because you were
I'll
shaking
do
your
that.
head no
Turns
like
out
this. I was like, wow.
You might be a narcissist, so we have to be.
That's true.
I'm a little
Let's wait till
concerned
after my therapy
before I take
session.
you as my
Yes.
neighbor.
If you don't know what we're talking about, go see the previous episode. Okay. Out of those 5 types, is there one that's most common?
I would have to say probably the grandiose, the classical narcissist.
Okay.
Yeah,
so that's why we think of it because it is the most common.
That's it.
Okay. What am I not asking you about narcissistic personality disorder as it is defined from understanding it that I need to be asking?
All the patterns I gave you are what you see of the 9 characteristics that a diagnostic manual like the DSM would require. What's really interesting is that our diagnostic manuals are now taking sort of a new direction in how we think about these personality patterns. And in the most, not to put too kind of bookish a point on it, but the DSM now views narcissism and all of the personality disorders through a new kind of a lens. And it looks at, for example, how a person views their own identity, and the narcissist's identity is very much caught up in how they're viewed by other people. So they don't have a core sense of self. Their sense of self is governed entirely by the world outside of them. That's actually a terrifying feeling. Like, the only way I'm good is if everyone tells me I'm good today. That's very unstable.
Right.
We also look at goal setting. How do they set their goals? And narcissists set their goal in a way that will get them approval from the world. So either they set their goals unrealistically high so they can talk about the big goals they have, which they're never going to meet, or they set their goals a little too low so they know they're always going to surpass them. So, but no matter what, their goal setting, once again, is based on how they can talk to the world about these things. Then when we look at other areas, we look at empathy and their lack thereof. So now DSM is looking at this across all personality patterns, and people with narcissism don't have empathy. They look at people as existing to serve their needs. What can you do for me? And then I'll make a relationship with you. So that's why a lot of people say, but that narcissistic guy was really nice to me. I'm like, yeah, because he needed you as a sales contact.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh. Or they like the fact that you live in the right neighborhood in town. There's a need being served. And then finally, DSM is looking at narcissism through the lens of intimacy. And that's one thing that narcissists are not good at. They're not good at intimacy. They're not good at close relationships. By and large, their relationships are superficial and are really engaged in for personal gain. So they might get a very attractive partner because that makes them look good to the world. They might get a wealthy partner because that will make sure they have lots of money. They might get a famous partner so that they look good to the world. I mean, the characteristics on which they choose the partner are deeply, deeply superficial. And so that's how a narcissist chooses. And so when we look at those areas, self, goal setting, empathy, and intimacy, that's another way to view narcissism. No matter what, it's just really it comes down to that core insecurity, that sense they cannot regulate themselves from the inside out, that they don't have a good sense of identity, and that they're really reliant on the world for telling them what they're about, which makes them actually quite resentful.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. In our next video, we are going to dive deep into what causes narcissistic personality disorder.